Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Morton. My pronouns are she, her. I am the artist and studio manager here at Baltimore Clayworks. We are thrilled that you all have joined us. I would like to acknowledge that I am joining from my office located on Piscataway and Susquehannock lands, currently known as Baltimore, Maryland. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our virtual artist talk given today by Emily Lamb. She was a long-term resident artist at Baltimore Clayworks from 2019 to 2022 and was a recipient of the Nyberg Grant. For more information about our artist talk, please visit our virtual library at baltimoreclayworks.org. I will now turn it over to Emily.
Thank you so much. And hello, everybody. Like she said, my name is Emily Lamb, and I recently completed my 3-year-long residency at Baltimore Clayworks. I'm going to talk just a little bit about some of my recent work that I've done and a little bit about what I want or what I'm doing in the future now that I'm out of Baltimore Clayworks. But mostly I'm going to be talking about what I've shared during what I've learned through the Nyberg Grant and my experience and like what I did with that opportunity. So a little bit about myself first. I'm originally from Denver, Colorado, where I grew up with a mother who was also a full-time artist. So I've been making art for as long as I can remember. And so when I started or were ready to go off to college, I definitely knew what I wanted to do, which brought me out to Virginia Commonwealth University of the Arts, where I explored lots of different mediums and eventually ended up in the craft and materials department, which is where I first discovered glass and ceramics and totally fell in love with, blowing glass and sculpting out of clay. When I graduated, I pursued a little bit more of like the glass world. And I missed making the ceramics, but I kind of took that opportunity of right after school to travel. So I've worked out in Seattle and learned lots of glass. I've gone to lots of different craft schools like Haystack and Penland. And then I've even gone and apprenticed for glass blowers in Norway and Denmark and had a really great time just kind of traveling all over and learning as much as I could. But at the end of that, I was really ready to settle down and actually start making some work. And I wanted to get back into the ceramics. So when I came back to, which brought me to, sorry, I forgot to share my screen. Which brought me to Maryland. And then I discovered Baltimore Clayworks. Baltimore Clayworks was an amazing opportunity because not only did I have my studio, but I had great resources to learn more about ceramics. And it also kind of introduced me to a broader ceramic community. So while I've been here at Baltimore Clayworks, now that I finally was able to have access to a ceramic studio and also a glass studio, I wanted to try to put them together. They're both very similar materials in a lot of ways, but they're inherently incompatible. So I kind of took that as a challenge. And I really wanted to make them look like they liked each other, even though they don't. So this is one of the pieces that I made here. The bottom part is glass and the top part is ceramics. The main reason why they don't like each other is because ceramic shrinks and glass doesn't. And you can't fuse them together while they're hot because they both need to be hot to be, made because they're going to break each other. So what I engineered out of that was to first make the ceramic, fire it and let it shrink, and then take those pieces and sculpt the bottom part, which is going to be the skirt. Then once I had them look like they were together, so it was raw clay and then fired clay, I would take the fired clay off, make a mold of the skirt part, take out the clay of the mold, be able to blow glass into the mold, and then I could puzzle piece them together. And a few of the shots of that, so you could see the mold on the left and me and my glass blowing crew like blowing this big bubble to be able to make that skirt. And then me on the right there having to like then take that mold off. And the most enjoyable part of this process for me was that it wasn't just enjoying the fun of glass blowing. It wasn't just enjoying the fun of sculpting, in the figures, but it was also bringing in mold making techniques and also gluing and faux finishing techniques. So like bringing in a lot of my different skill sets just to make this one piece. So the ceramic and the glass, even though they were puzzle pieced together, there's still seams that kind of make them not perfectly together. So I use my knowledge of different types of glues and epoxies and fillers to kind of faux finish so that the end result is that they actually are, they look like they're seamless. So this is another piece that uses some of the same principles of the bubbles. The glass bubbles here in the center were made in a mold, even though the mold is now gone. And then the ceramic pieces that I made, it was hard because I had to try to sculpt them to make them look like they fit, but I also had to sculpt them in a way where I knew that there was going to be a little bit of shrinkage and how it was going to fit. And then the other opportunity that I was able to do here at Baltimore Clay Works was to utilize their large kilns. So I've sculpted one full-size figure before in college, and I was really excited to try to do that again. So while I was here, I made a full-size figure that, you know, would just barely fit into the kiln. And the fun story with this piece, which I love to tell my students, is that she actually completely exploded in the kiln. And, you know, that's always such a heartbreaking moment as a ceramicist. And most of the time it's like, I just throw it away. And, you know, sometimes my students, they have that same feeling of they've just worked so long during like an 8-week course, and now it's exploded, and like, what a waste of time. But I always have this mantra of like, I can fix anything. So she's actually a lot of plaster and a lot of epoxy clays and a lot of glues, but it's a good kind of lesson that I've taught myself and that I also share with my students of like, no, you can still put it back together. So now I'm going to talk about the Mary E. Nyberg Grant, which is an endowment fund that began in 2007. Mary was a lifelong supporter of Baltimore Clay Works, and she was one time a resident artist. And so now the grant is awarded to one artist every year to help their artistic development, which could be in a class form, or it could be in a certain project that they wanted to do. And what I chose to do with it is there's an artist named Brian Booth Craig, who's an amazing realistic figure sculptor. He's a contemporary sculptor who specializes in bronze, sculpting from life. His work translates classically derived figures into contemporary icons. He teaches art workshops in the United States, Italy, Brazil, and South Africa. And his work has been exhibited extensively in the United States and internationally. So Brian's home studio is located in the Poconos near the Delaware Water Gap. So he has a large studio where he's able to make his own work, host different models, have residencies, and then also he does lots of workshops. And so not only does he have a large studio for sculpting, but he also has a large barn where he's able to weld, make molds, do wax casting. So the class that I took with him was actually a portrait workshop instead of a figure workshop. And I'm going to share a little bit of like the tips that I've learned there, because I also, you know, teach portrait workshops here, and I wanted to learn different ways, because lots of artists approach the figure or, you know, anything in different ways, and so I wanted to kind of expand my own knowledge that I could bring back to my students. So this is the armature that we first started with. So unlike, you know, a ceramicist working with water-based clay, we worked a lot with oil-based clay, and primarily is because he's a bronze caster and it's easier to work with that clay for the bronze making process. I feel like both clays are very similar in a lot of ways, and both have their pros and cons. But because we were working with oil-based clay and we were building solid, we definitely needed an armature. So this is just the armature that we started with, which is just armature wire, and the white part there is actually styrofoam ball. The styrofoam ball was mostly just so that you don't have to waste so much clay and so that it's not so heavy. But you can kind of see like that's the start for the neck, and then that's going to be where your head's going to be. So the most important part that, or there's lots of important parts, but one of the parts that was really fascinating to me and where you first start with a head was to first work based off the silhouette or the line of the center of your face. And what was interesting to me was, instead of the way I've always approached doing faces is, okay, I know a head looks like this and I know the eyes are about here, this was so much easier because if you have your model and then you have your piece and then you have you're able to line them all up, and then all you have to do is match your clay up to the silhouette of the piece. And so you don't have to, in your head, be like, well, I think this looks like a forehead, or I think this looks like a nose, or maybe the nose needs to come out more. You don't have to think about any of that stuff. You're just matching up the line. So when you're cutting that out, then it looks kind of silly because it's like, well, that doesn't look like a face. But from the profile, you can see how that works so much better. And so it's kind of taking away the worry of like, well, this doesn't look good. This doesn't look good. Like, it doesn't look like a face yet. You just have to work one angle at a time. And once you first start with this middle part, then you can start going around and doing all different lines of your face. And eventually, the more you do that, the more that realism is going to come through. The most important part of why we start with the center of the face is that this is the center of the only part of your face that doesn't have any plane change. This is always going to be one straight line. There's nothing coming through. So like, for example, a bad place to start would be doing the line from your forehead to your eye to your cheek, because your cheek actually goes up and it's going to mess up the silhouette. So this part is the best place to start off at the base. Besides working, from the silhouette, we also took lots of measurements. The most important parts to start with are 4 points, or technically 5 if you count each ear, but we started with the top of the hairline, the tip of the nose, the bottom of the chin, and the holes right before each ear hole here. And on the model, we actually put stickers on the model, and then to make sure that they didn't change each time you took a caliper measurement. And why these points are so important is not only do those measurements tell you how high or wide they are, but once you connect them all together, it triangulates the depth of the face. Brian mentioned that one of the a common mistake in most portraiture is that you can have a hyper realistic face from this point of view, but once you start to turn your figure, maybe your face is too flat, or maybe it's coming back too much. So it's really important to really measure to measure the depth of the curvature of the face. And so with these points, you can really triangulate that. Besides just normal measurements of like, well, how wide is each eye? How wide is your nose? Any measurements that you want to take off the face, you want to go back to these points. And to mark them on your sculpture, what we did, you can't really see them, but if you look right at the tip of the nose, there's a little reflective part there. We actually took nails, and they were painted with orange on them, but we would actually take nails and put them into our sculpture and make sure that they all lined up, not just the height wise, but also the depth wise. And then we left them in our sculpture the entire time. And the reason why that's so important is because as you're working on your sculpture and you start maybe going into the eye or doing measurements, you can keep this steady to always reference back to. So with the measurements, hopefully you can see some of this. I didn't know it was getting cut off. So we were working in a 3/4 scale, or about 3/4 scale. And to convert life-size measurements down into 3/4 scale, he gave us this chart, which it's a little hard to explain, but I'm going to try to do my best. So what you would do is first draw a line, and you would measure the actual measurement of the model's head, which is usually right underneath the chin to the very top of the head. And that distance is going to be the distance of that line A. And then you'd keep your calipers from point A, from on point A and on point B, and you would draw that curve, which is line B. Then you would measure out how big you wanted the head of your model or your sculpture to be. So if it would be a little bit smaller, like let's say you wanted to make it half size, whatever measurement that would be, you take that measurement, you put it on point B, and you do another curve. And that would determine point C. So you can kind of see that those two X's or curved X's in between point C, that is where what would determine where line C comes up to. So once you have kind of this pizza slice, from there, you can do any measurement, like the width of the head, put your calipers on, starting at point A, and draw it up. And so then from any measurement that you need to know for your sculpture would actually be the distance between those two lines. So you can go up and take your calipers and transfer it over to your sculpture. So this is the one that we used for our model. And so you can see kind of, there's lots of those scratch marks in between that pizza slice. That is the calipers of the actual measurements going up. And then between both notches, so like the first one that says nose, the nose of the measurement of the nose for your sculpture would be the distance between those two notches. So on this one, you can see that orange nail there. And so putting on these measurements in, it's really important that you not just make a little dot of like, okay, this is my measurements for like where my eyes are going to go, but it's really good to like take a knife and draw lots of lines. And even if you've measured your eye once and you've placed it somewhere, it's important that you're always going back to it because things start to change. The more measurements you actually place on your face, the more they kind of warp. And so a lot of the process was doing the work, turning it around, editing this part, and then coming back and realizing, no, all this was garbage, you got to slice it off. And so the class that I took was 5 days long, and we didn't really start doing details, or like, honestly, it didn't really start looking like a face until the very last day, or maybe like the second to last day, because most of the time it was just editing. So another important part was to not focus on the features. And that's one thing that I always tell my students too. The face is so much more than just eyes, nose, and lips. It's really about the structure and the bone structure and like how the skin folds and the highlights. And it's one of the hardest things to get right, which is why it's so important to always do that silhouette lining up with the model and turning it and doing this angle and not being afraid to scrape stuff off. Or, a lot of times, especially if you go into details too soon, because it's fun. It's like, well, this is fun sculpting an eyeball. And then you turn it and it's like, oh no, I realized that it's in the wrong place, but I really don't want to scrape it off because I would waste those 4 hours of work. So to save yourself from that, it's to really just ignore the details until the very, very end. And so you can kind of see my, it kept changing quite a bit because I'd always stare at it and be like, no, the forehead needs to change, or staring at it or like, no, this part needs to change. So it really evolved over time. Eventually near the end, I did exactly what I just said you shouldn't do, of like going into the details, because I was just having so much fun doing like the tip of the nose and the lips. And then sure enough, I figured out later that like, everything's like a millimeter off in this angle, but I was running out of time too. I could have worked like a month on this piece, but we only had 5 days. So these are some of the tools that we worked with. A lot of the same tools that we work with in ceramics can be worked with in oil-based clay. Just a few of the different ones though. The third from the left, they are special tools that he actually has custom made in Italy, but it's pretty much a loop tool, but it's squiggly on the top. And those work really well because they kind of like cheese grade off and can really like blend the skin better than like having to carve it with something flat, or, you know, in ceramics, we use a lot of serrated ribs. When I came back and started working back in, you know, water-based clay, I tried these tools on the water-based clay and they don't work. I mean, they're nice, but they don't work quite the same. But, and then my favorite tool. So when you want to start really smoothing out the skin, it's handmade loop tools with guitar string. And so this was like a really baby little tool with a tiny little guitar string wire that was great for doing lots of details. And the reason why you can't just, or you shouldn't just use a normal loop tool is because that just gouges, but the ridges on this loop tool kind of blends or rakes. So this is approaching kind of that final smoothing stage. And then finally, oh, I thought I had one more, but. And then finally I kind of had to like, okay, hurry up, gotta put some hair on it because it's the end. But so I share this photo because these were two of the other classmates. We were all working on the same model. And it's interesting to see, because they're all, you know, good sculptures, but it's cool to see how like different, like we're all doing the same process. We're all still following the same measurements. We're all doing the same rules. However, it shows that if you have one measurement just slightly off, it can change a face pretty dramatically, I think, because it's not just like, oh, my eyes are a little too high. It's no, this whole angle is going out a little bit, and they're very, very subtle. They're like just millimeters off, but I don't know, it goes to show like how much work you really have to put in to like make sure every aspect of the face is right if you want to achieve hyperrealism like Brian does. Oh, so this one, I had lined up to the model. But. So yeah, all in all, it was a great experience. I learned a ton and I can't wait to like share this with my own students. I really look forward to like hopefully taking a figure class with him one day. But right now that my residency has ended at Baltimore Clay Works, I have moved into a home studio where I have 2 kilns that are now operational. So I'm really excited to keep working. I still have access to hot shops, so I'm still blowing glass. And the next kind of thing that I want to learn is actually bronze casting, not just because I'm inspired by Brian's work in that process, but I was part of a show in Loveland, Colorado, which is a big bronze community. So I'm interested to learn more about that because it's not just the sculpting, it's also mold making, it's also working with wax, it's also welding, it's also chasing, it's also patinas. So I'm really excited to kind of like dip my toes into that. However, it's also really expensive, but you know, just like glass blowing is really expensive, I'm like, no, I want to learn it. So that's what I have going on in my future.